Tom, I want to start today by giving a little shout out to a guardian in the Vino Veritas Society who I've known for several years, named Mike Lazar. Mike sent us an article last week that was written by Brent Hamachek about the role of being a dissident in America in the 21st century.
Sounds like we're talking about the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War.
Right.
But we're talking about being a dissident in the United States today.
And it's funny, and we'll get into it because he actually talks about the Soviet Union in the piece. But just wanted to give Mike a little shout out to get us started today. Mike is the media director of Chapter 7 in Northern Colorado. And as the media director, one of the things he does is he's constantly on top of what's out there in the news. And he came across this piece and thought it was really well thought out and a really interesting take, and decided to share it with us.
Kudos to Mike, and also for our listeners, if they want this article. It has kind of a long academic-sounding title. What's the title, Dave? You have it in front of you.
Understanding and Embracing the Role of the 21st Century American Dissident.
So if we get to talk to Mr. Hamachek, we might try to school him a little bit on shortening his titles, dissidents in the 21st century or something like that. But we will make this available. We'll get it up on our website. We might put a link to it on the next issue of Lumen that goes out. We'll make sure if our listeners want to see the original article that we're going to talk about, that they get it.
And some of our chapters have already started sharing it on Basecamp. I'm sure the rest will as well.
There are lots of advantages to being part of a chapter. We keep telling people that you want to be in a chapter.
Most of them will have already seen this by the time they get the podcast, as opposed to hearing about it now and stopping to go back and read it first.
Well, and so after Mike shared it, you and I both, you read it, and you found it interesting. You forwarded it on to me, and I too. I think it is a very thoughtful essay. It's one of those pieces where even if there are parts that you disagree with, the disagreement itself is illuminating. You learn something disagreeing with the author. And
which, by the way, is kind of the point of what we're doing within our chapters at the Vino Veritas Society, right? I mean, the goal is not to just say, here's the answer and go forth. It's let's take a look at the right types of content. Let's take a look at the right types of things and discuss them and understand them better and understand the perspective and determine, is this correct or is it not?
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that, sometimes looking at wrong content, right? Looking at bad content.
Sure.
And here's what I mean. If, I don't know, who's one of our favorite people to pick, if Miss Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez writes a treatise on modern-day Keynesian socialist economics, we would probably look at it, right? We would probably do a case study on it.
I am dying to read that article.
But I mean, the point is, those of us who care about freedom, we need to know what kind of arguments that our enemies are making.
Absolutely.
There's a reason for many years back when I used to be teaching in college classrooms, I would do a senior seminar on Karl Marx, because I thought, hey, we need young Americans to understand what Marx actually argued, and we do the same thing here in the Vino Veritas Society. Let me say this so we're going to talk about this piece and what it means for us as citizens, and also what it means for us as guardians within the Vino Veritas Society, because there are a lot of important ways that what we're doing lines up with and complements the arguments that Hamachek is making in this essay. And probably the most important, the biggest observation I had about this essay is a big sweeping perspective. It's not looking at one narrow topic, and it's not looking at a narrow slice of time. In fact, he goes out of his way to warn fellow conservatives. This problem that we have today, remember the whole article is about being a dissident. If you care about constitutional government, individual liberty, private property, free markets and capitalism, those kinds of subjects, you're no longer just a fellow citizen who disagrees with some of your other citizens. His point is much stronger. We become basically dissidents. We are now, our beliefs in freedom are opposed to the regime, but what has become the progressive orthodoxy. It includes government, but it has also crept into all the important, powerful, influential institutions around us. And the point that he makes, the warning he offers, to fellow conservatives is to say, this problem, this is much bigger than just the last election or the last two elections or the next election cycle. That if you think, if only Donald Trump had just won in 2020, his point is, no, we still have this enormous problem of this gigantic progressive administrative state that is becoming increasingly hostile to expressions of freedom.
It's interesting. You talk about it's more than this election or the last election or the last couple elections, the next election. He said something in this piece that had always stuck out to me during my undergrad. And as you know, I went to CU Boulder. I had plenty of progressive professors and people teaching progressive ideas.
By the way, this is a side note, and I don't want to derail us. I have to say this, though. You're living evidence that philosophy, true, genuine philosophy, is always possible. That no matter how much we surround people with certain forms of indoctrination, it is possible for the human mind to think for itself.
I hope my dad's listening to this one because I'll credit him with that. He's the one who taught me how to think.
Yeah.
As we talk about some of this stuff, I still remember that class where we spent an entire segment of the semester talking about the political pendulum, right?
Right.
And how politics in America, I remember we read, who wrote it? It was The Three Waves of Democracy. Do you remember that book?
Yeah, vaguely.
It was Friedman, but it wasn't the Friedman that we all talk about, but I think his last name was Friedman.
Right.
And we talk about how we have this pendulum that goes back and forth, and sometimes it's a little more left and sometimes it's a little more right. But the professor's point, believe it or not, was that at the end of the day, we end up back at sort of a center-right position. That's the midpoint of that pendulum. I wonder if he's teaching the same thing today. We're 25 years since I was in that class, 25 years since I was in that class. And I sit and I wonder, is he still teaching that same thing? Because what the author, what Hamachek says in here is, we all talk about the political pendulum because it makes us feel good. We talk about the political pendulum that says sometimes Trump is going to win and sometimes Obama is going to win, and we're going to go back and forth. And even more lately, you look back at the late 19th century, it was dominated by Republicans, right? Yeah. From the most part, we only had Republican presidents for the latter half of the 19th century. And then we get to today, and almost every election, we're flipping parties. Yep. And so there's that pendulum. And he's making the argument really importantly in here that while the presidency might change.
And Congress too.
And Congress might change. While politicians themselves the party dominance might change. Yep. The governing orthodoxy of the country is becoming increasingly more progressive, more left, more big government. Yep. And I think it's a really interesting piece.
It's hugely important. In fact, it goes to something. I mean, I've been trying to make this argument in various ways for 20 years, and truthfully, this is a big reason why you and I started the Vino Veritas Society, because so many of our conservative friends, allies, fellow, freedom travelers, free marketeers, constitutionalists, they often cannot look beyond the next election cycle or maybe the next two election cycles. Who's going to run for governor next time? Who's going to run for president? Who's going to run for this seat in Congress or these seats in the state legislature? And that's the limit of their horizon. And yet what we're really up against is something far, far bigger that dwarfs those partisan short-term elections. And we know this in part because the truth is, even if we could elect Republicans up and down, control Congress, control state legislatures up and down, they would do some good things. I have no doubt about that. But the truth is, many Republicans today, they don't know why the Republican Party was founded. They don't know what the Republican Party really stands for. They don't understand the founding of the country, of the regime. Mm-hmm. They don't really understand the idea of constitutional government thoroughly. And more importantly, most of them, or many of them, don't understand how much progressivism has crept into their own thinking. They don't realize, many people who call themselves conservative Republicans have absorbed by osmosis. It's hard to be a United States citizen today and not be a progressive because It's everywhere. It's on TV. It's on everything we see, we hear. It's in the water. It's in the air. It's everywhere. And so when you step back and you say, okay, we understand that the parties have gone back and forth. Sometimes Republicans control the Senate, for example. Sometimes Democrats control the Senate and the White House and the House of Representatives. And we look at this bigger phenomenon of progressivism, progressive central planning. You and I have pointed this out before. It's so important it's worth repeating. This has been going on now for 150 years. This movement towards progressive central planning, this emerged immediately after the Civil War, right? We're going back to the early 1870s. That's when this started. And if you look at government not along party lines, which party has controlled it,
right?
But instead you look at it as progressive central planning versus individual liberty, versus free markets, private property, individual freedom. Then over the last 150 years, it has been one continuous movement in one direction towards progressive central planning. That premise of progressive central planning has never been seriously, not fundamentally challenged. Even a Ronald Reagan, arguably the most influential spokesperson for constitutional government in the last century, and maybe let's add a non-politician. Rush Limbaugh and Ronald Reagan combined, between the two of them, we're talking about a large sphere of influence. They influenced millions and millions of fellow citizens. They could not undermine, discredit that fundamental premise of progressive central planning. And in fact, we know this from the evidence. Government continued to grow. Government was bigger when Reagan left than when he started. Government was bigger when Rush Limbaugh died and ended his career than when he began. And that's the big problem that Brent Hamachek is looking at. And that's the big problem that the Vino Veritas Society was created to confront. We're not in this to say we're going to guarantee certain electoral victories in the next election cycle. Our goal, we want the Vino Veritas Society to be here. Well, this might sound a little morbid, but it's true. Long after we're gone,
right?
Long after we're gone, we want the Vino Veritas Society to be around 100 years from now, 200 years from now, in the far future, when people are gathering to learn about freedom, the arts of freedom. They're going to be gathering at chapter meetings of the Vino Veritas Society.
I mean, essentially, we're saying that if we're successful, that 150 years from now, people who are trying to advocate for big government, because there will always be big government advocates. There always have been, there always will be. There will be people who say, no, I'm better than you, or I'm better than that. My group of people is better than that group of people, and we should have more power. We want them to be the dissidents.
Right.
And in fact, and you've pointed this out before, they were the dissidents 150 years ago.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the right place to start. You think about our diagram of we talk about the founders coming in 1776, these imperfect people striving for that Declaration of Independence. And when they do, Lincoln took a massive step towards achieving a freer, better society.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, we started having the rise of dissidents. We had people who were saying, that Civil War, if that was caused because of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and this idea of freedom, then maybe people shouldn't have freedom. And they became dissidents. And it's taken them 150 years. In fact, I just said, they started in the 1870s.
These are early progressives.
Right. The early progressives.
As dissidents, right.
Right. They began as dissidents in the 1870s while we had decades of Republican presidents.
That's right.
And Republican-led Congresses. So this whole idea here that, just because you have control of Congress, you're gonna save things. The other thing is they knew right away this wasn't going to change overnight. And they went in and they put in the time, and it was 44 years from 1870 until Woodrow Wilson gets into office.
Yeah.
So when you think about that timeline, I just want everybody to really think about being a part of this we're not going to change even if you change elections and even if we change a few minds, we are now the dissidents. Yep. We are now in the position the progressives were in at that time.
Well, let's offer a definition here just to make sure that we're clear and our listeners are following along. So when I think of dissident, I think of someone who is disagreeing. It's the root of the word dissident. They're disagreeing. They're opposing the orthodoxy,
right,
of the regime. The regime, and by regime, I mean this in a big, kind of classical Aristotelian sense. So the regime is not merely the government. It includes the government, but the regime is more than the government. It's the government plus what we today would call culture. Aristotle didn't really have a word for culture, but when he talked about a regime, it was the laws, it was the positions of power, but it was also what people praised, what they found to be praiseworthy,
sure,
what they found to be shameful and embarrassing, right? Add all those things together, the culture and the government, and that is the regime. And those who oppose the regime, who say, no, we think what the regime stands for is wrong.
Right.
It's mistaken, is bad. We want to change that. That is being a dissident. And certainly if the regime is a tyrannical regime, that becomes deadly serious. That's when tyrannies will create secret police forces and death camps and terrible things. They will torture people, kidnap people, kill people to shut them up, shut them down, because they don't want dissidents.
Right.
Threaten the foundation of the regime. They're saying the whole regime is built on lies or on a mistake or on something wrong. And so it's in the interest of the regime to shut down and silence dissidents. And this is one of the striking claims that Mr. Hamachek makes in his essays, that we who believe in freedom, we who believe in the idea, the American idea, those self-evident truths enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that we have a natural right to liberty and our private property, and government should protect those things, and that's it, not manage or control all of society. We're now dissidents. We
right.
stand in opposition to what has become the progressive orthodoxy. It's also interesting, your point about those early progressives. If you go back and you look at the 1870s and 80s and 90s, America was very much a constitutional republic, and citizens tended to be constitutionalists in the full meaning of that word. Not merely they understood and supported their constitution. That was part of it. But also that they were constitutionalists in the sense that they thought government for the most part should stay out of their lives. Mm-hmm. They thought it was undeniable. It wasn't even worth debating. Of course people have a right to their property, to use their property any way that they want. They thought like constitutionalists. They were, maybe this is the most telling part, those Americans in that time period, they were more trusting of each other as fellow citizens than they were of government.
Well, that's certainly changed.
In a way, that's kind of the litmus test of where we used to be versus where we are today. Then they said, they were realistic. They knew fellow citizens can do bad things. There are thieves and murderers and rapists out there. They knew that. And they looked at government. They thought, but those people in government have this terrible, awesome power that no other fellow citizens do. And so we distrust those in government more than we distrust any fellow citizens. That has changed completely. But it's interesting that early generation of progressives, precisely because they were dissidents, they were the few in a constitutional republic. They were surrounded by freedom lovers. I think that caused those early progressives to think long-term. They had to have a long-term strategy. They were so few in number, those early progressives, they knew they're not going to change America in the next election cycle or in the next 2 or the next 10 election cycles. Mm-hmm. They had to think, how do we take these dissident progressive ideas of control and subsidies and regulations, these various forms of, add a dash of fascism and a dash of socialism and a dash of communism, and let's call that progress. How do we spread those ideas throughout the United States over a long period of time? And that's when they started thinking about education. So they didn't actually focus on elections first. They started focusing on, let's build progressive universities,
right,
where future generations will go to be learned. your school, University of Colorado, right? Is a modern progressive research university.
Right.
Let's build institutions like that, because then we'll be influencing and training Americans for generations. And they thought at that point, the election victories will come. They'll just come naturally.
I'm going to take that even a little further. They didn't start by saying, we're not going to win this in the next 10 election cycles. They started by looking at it and saying, this is wrong. What the Civil War, what just happened, is wrong. We know we need something a little bit different. We think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. We need to go learn. And they left the country. They looked around the American university system and they saw a bunch of classical liberal education, educational institutions. And they said, we're not going to find it here. Let's go to Germany. Let's go to Europe. Let's go learn how they're doing things. And then let's bring it back. They left for a decade plus.
They literally engaged in cultural appropriation, right? These Americans went to Europe, went to Germany, and they stole German ideas of tyranny and brought it to America.
So to all the people who say this has to happen overnight, that's why we're talking about what it is to be a dissident and how we got here, right? We have gotten here. There's one other point you touched on briefly that I want to make a little bigger. When you talk about how things have switched from 150 years ago to today, and how the constitutionalist was the prevailing regime, prevailing orthodoxy of the 1860s, 1870s to today, the other difference was at that time, not only did people not trust government, and they trusted each other. Today, government, because it's grown so much, and something we talk about all the time, something we talked about in our most recent case study for our chapters, was this idea that the bigger the government gets, the more crony corruption there is in the government. And what we see today is the regime, the progressive regime, is not just government. And he points this out in the article too.
Great point.
The regime itself is made up of nameless, faceless corporations and bureaucracies that we don't even know who they are.
And some we do, right? We know the Google and the Facebook of the world and Twitter, right? And all these big tech companies, as well as other big companies.
But we don't know who the people are.
Right.
And under that constitutional orthodoxy, 150 years ago, you knew who your elected officials were. You knew who was in Washington representing you. They were rarely in Washington. They were more often back at home, so you actually got to know them and spend time with them. And towns were smaller, populations were smaller, so on and so forth. But then you get into today, our elected officials are spending more and more time in Washington. They're feeding this nameless, faceless bureaucracy, the alphabet soup of institutions that you like to refer to. And those are being propped up by Facebook. And it's not just Mark Zuckerberg, and propped up by Amazon and Google, but it's not Bezos and Zuckerberg and Dorsey. It's all of the employees inside of there that we don't know who any of them are.
Legions, right, of unknown to most of us employees, almost all of whom are educated in progressive universities, right? And I wanted to make one more point here related to all of this. It goes back to the partisanship point, the political parties. When progressivism emerged in the late 19th century, the two political parties we have today they were the dominant political parties then, the Republican and the Democratic Party. At that point in time, the Republican Party was more of a regional party located in the northern part of the United States. The Democratic Party was the only truly national party. There were Democrat strongholds all over the country. And when these first generations of progressives started learning and writing and studying, it was not at all clear which of either the political parties would become conduits for progressivism. The progressive strategy was, let's influence both. Let's just take over both, either directly or indirectly, namely through the modes of education. Everyone who's going to be a future political operator in any way, we don't care if they become a Republican or a Democrat, they're going to go to college, and we will have our influence on them then. People forget that some of the first progressive advocates were high-profile Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, lifelong Republican. And it took decades for progressivism to really settle into the Democratic Party Remember, the Democratic Party had a long history of states' rights, right? And that whole fight prior to the Civil War, they prided themselves on certain elements of limited constitutional government. So it took decades for progressivism to kind of settle down into and make the Democratic Party its home base. And then it took even longer for the Republican Party to be something like the opposition to progressivism. As late as the presidency of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, in many ways, was a progressive. He thought like a progressive. He launched the unconstitutional war on drugs. He helped create the Environmental Protection Agency, right? He expanded these progressive regulatory agencies. He expanded the office of, this is one of my favorites, the Office of Price and Wage Control. That was an office within the White House. It sounds like something out of an Ayn Rand novel, right? A bunch of bureaucrats sitting there scratching their chins, deciding what prices and wages will be in private businesses. And my point is, this was what progressivism was kind of shot through the Republican Party. There was this budding conservative movement, and it tended to attract Republicans. So most conservatives were Republicans, but it's not right to say most Republicans were conservatives. There were a lot of kind of lukewarm progressives who were Republicans.
Well, and I think all of our members and the people listening and the people we talk to on a day-to-day basis, they're constantly thinking, they're constantly having to focus, am I thinking this through correctly? Because our instincts, our natural instinct is to go towards progressivism. We were having a conversation just a few days ago at a meeting where somebody said, well, but we still need the FDA. Those are human beings in the FDA. You're telling me that we need the FDA because human beings are imperfect and don't always have the best intentions. We have this natural assumption within us that the minute they become government officials, the minute they join a government agency, they stop being human beings.
And remember Madison's famous line in the Federalist, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. The progressive response to Madison seems to be, well, they become angels as soon as they start working for the government.
And we're taught that over and over and over again until the point that it becomes instinctual. Mm-hmm. And that's what the dissident progressives did or began doing 150 years ago. They began to say, as soon as you get into government, you can trust government. Yeah. The founders said you can't trust government. You need a small government. It needs to be controlled. And then all of a sudden, that led to this massive civil war that was so devastating. Maybe you can trust government, you can't trust people.
Right.
And now we need to kind of flip that script. And I think today's podcast has turned into just sort of this really nice overview of what the Vino Veritas Society is all about, in the sense that now you've pointed out, and we've pointed out through several podcasts, this idea that all of the bad social pathologies have just been skyrocketing as a result of progressivism.
Yeah.
And we're at that point now where we're saying all these mass random murders and abuse and teen suicide and all of these horrific things that are happening in our society, look at progressivism. Mm-hmm. It's time we start going in a different, back into the direction of the Declaration, back in the direction of freedom.
And I'll add, by the way, Dave, I'm getting a hunch that we might have to continue a discussion about this great article in the next podcast. I don't know if we're going to be able to finish it up, but I will say I wanted to add in here sort of the next step in Hamachek's argument, because it shows not only why it's important what we're doing at the Vino and Veritas Society, but why right now it's probably more important, critical moment than ever before, because several events have come together. The old poetic way would be to say they conspired together. And I want to assure all of our listeners, you and I did not cause any of these events to happen. It just so happened these things occurred at the moment we were forming the Vino and Veritas Society. But when you take everything you and I have been talking about, this 150-year trajectory of progressive central planning, and then you look at the last year, what's been going on? And I'll give Hamachek credit here. He points out these three kind of earth-shaking, transformative events. The first being the virus, the coronavirus. I mean, this has transformed everything. It's the way people work, whether people are working, whether they're going to school. I mean, all kinds of things, whether they're going to walk around with their faces covered with masks or not. It has changed the landscape, cultural, educational, political landscape in the United States. It also incentivized many Americans who felt powerless all of a sudden became powerful because they could narc on their neighbor. And that's a source of power. That I've never liked that neighbor of mine, and there's that bastard walking around without a mask. I'm calling him in. Or I see him having a party over in his house. And multiple states set up these hotlines and special websites where you could turn in your neighbors, right, for violating mask mandates.
Take that a step further. We don't know the details yet, but I don't know if you saw the video going around of the women who got in the fight in Bath and Body Works this week at the mall.
I missed that one.
We're talking about, these are suburban middle class women, well put together, well dressed, got in a physical altercation in line at a Bath and Body Works. And we don't know the details yet, but I'm willing to bet for the right odds that it was about somebody wasn't wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that kind of behavior, it's okay. She wasn't wearing a mask, so I can attack her, right? Never in a million years would we say, sure, let's go get in a physical altercation in line over at Bath and Body Works in the mall. But all of a sudden, because she wasn't wearing a mask, I'm now right. I'm entitled. I can go do whatever I want to her.
For the record, I'm no epidemiologist, but I'm pretty confident you're more likely to catch a contagious disease punching someone and getting their blood and saliva all over yourself. Just putting that out.
Correct.
There. So this is one of the things that Hamachek, he calls our attention to, the coronavirus, and then the death of George Floyd, and the rioting, the unleashing of not just anger, but also, well, really, it's what Shelby Steele, who's a fine thinker and author, he wrote a book. By the way, Shelby Steele has dark black skin, and he wrote a book on white guilt. And this is what Hamachek, I think, is talking about, this phenomenon unleashed after the death of George Floyd, this tremendous pent-up white guilt, thinking we have to do something, we have to change something in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic and everything that goes along with it. And then the third event were the events on January 6th in the nation's capital. Put those three things together, and in the framework of the larger progressive movement over many decades. And Hamachek makes the argument that we're now at a place where millions of progressive Americans view conservatives, libertarians, constitutionalists, free marketeers, non-progressives. They view non-progressives as a serious threat to their health, to their safety, to national security. And the progressives, they're in charge. They control the levers of power in government. They, as you were talking before, they control the corporate boardrooms in big influential businesses, as well as they progressive staff those big businesses and actually make them work. And so you have layers and layers and layers of organizations.
Don't forget the media.
There's the media. There's the whole world of entertainment, right? You can't, I commented before, you can't watch a football game anymore. I feel like I'm in a religious ceremony in the Church of Progressivism, right? Just trying to watch a football game. Hamachek's point is, make no doubt about it. In fact, it will be dangerous to the cause of freedom, injurious to the cause of freedom if we freedom fighters don't understand our position. Our position is now that of a minority. We're not really in control of anything except for ourselves, our own words and choices, but we don't control the institutions that shape popular culture or popular opinion. Progressives do, and progressives do not view us as merely fellow citizens with some differing ideas. They view us as dangerous threats to their health, to their safety, to their security. And there's growing hostility, growing actions being taken to shut down and shut up dissidents like us who still care about human freedom and human flourishing. And I think he's right about that those three events together have put this razor-sharp edge on how progressivism is cutting along into our society, and it makes the Vino Veritas Society more important than ever before.
One of the things he also talks about, and he actually talks about it early on in the article, is this idea of we like to tell ourselves as the dissidents, as the freedom-oriented, the people who prefer freedom in the country. We like to tell ourselves we're a vocal minority or we're even a vocal majority. There's a lot of us out there who believe in this stuff, and we just need to get them riled up, and we need to get them out there, and we need to get them to vote. And his point is that doesn't matter, and that's not the case, because the actual institutions that are controlling daily life are going to prevent anything like that from taking shape. And they do that through spinning things like the George Floyd murder. They do things like spinning things like the January 6th Capitol building. I'm avoiding certain words but that's exactly the point. I hear certain words so much from the media that I'm tempted to use them. And you have to take that minute to think about what do you actually call that, and what actually was that. It wasn't an insurrection. It wasn't we did an entire conversation about that. So,
well, here I'd like to offer a couple examples.
Sure.
That I think help put some meat on those bones of what Hamachek is talking about when he says it doesn't really matter because progressive people have created all these institutions, and they're designed in a way to resist outside influence. Two kinds of presidents. A university president is one example I want to give, and the president of the United States is another example. A typical university, a modern research progressive university, like the one you attended, the University of Colorado. Colorado is one of the few states where our public university is governed by elected regents. There are 9 of them here. In most states, they're appointed. They tend to be crony friends of the governor or other politicos. But here in Colorado, they're elected. And Colorado still has these pockets of conservative citizens. And so they have elected a number of conservative regents to govern the University of Colorado. And those regents, in turn, have appointed some fairly conservative presidents. The past president, the current president, these are certainly not wildly left-wing liberal. They're not that at all. They tend to be more conservative. And the influence they have over the institution of the university is almost nothing. I don't want to say nothing because I don't want to give them no credit at all, but it's close to nothing in this sense. One of the ways that progressives design the university system is that the administration, so the president and all the office staff and the people who raise the money and take care of the budget, that whole administrative side of a university has no influence over the academic side.
Right.
So there's a Department of Women's Studies at the University of Colorado. Those faculty, those tenured faculty, you know what they teach in the Department of Women's Studies? And the answer is whatever they want to teach.
Right.
Whatever they want to teach. The president of the university has zero influence. In fact, the president of the university can neither hire nor can he fire any one of those tenured faculty. And so conservatives say, "Oh, this is great. We're gonna hire this conservative president as the university, and he's really going to shake things up." No, the truth is not much is going to change. And the same is true for the president of the United States. Congress has created all kinds of unconstitutional, administrative, progressive agencies, offices, bureaus, commissions. The president of the United States has no power, no legal power at all, to get rid of any of them. He can't get rid of the FDA or get rid of the IRS these things are all created by statutory law. And so the president can issue some executive orders, which Trump did. For example, one of his more famous ones. He said, I want, for every new regulation, I want 2 old regulations that are no longer used much to be repealed, just to get rid of some of the regulations. Great idea, great concept. You know what happened within thousands of bureaucratic offices? Progressives, they're all progressives who staff these things. They said, okay, the president just handed down this executive order. We're going to form a study committee to try to figure out the process of how we'll choose the regulations that will get repealed. And this committee is going to study this for the next 2, 3, 4 years. Right? And so, yeah, the Trump administration did get rid of some regulations, and that was a good thing. But it was a dent. It was a tiny. It was a drop in an ocean, a drop of water in an ocean of a regulatory sea.
What's also interesting about that is you started talking about it, and I started thinking about what we've talked about, the imminent failure of central planning that always happens. When you have central planning, it is impossible for somebody at the middle, for those bureaucrats or a president, to know the needs and wants and actions of every single person within, if it's the president of the United States, of all 340, 50, 60 million Americans. And similarly, for a president of a university with 30,000 students, 40,000 plus when you consider graduate students, it is impossible for that president to know everything happening in every classroom. And those professors know it. And there's something interesting that we kind of need the dissidents out there to think about is they can't know what we're doing all the time. They can't tell us you can't live freely all the time because it's impossible for them to know it. And we have a choice of saying, no, we are going to be dissidents. We are going to fight for freedom. We are going to embrace freedom, or we're going to do whatever you say, regardless of whether or not you should have that power to say it or not.
Well, and that subject of those choices we make, how we talk, to whom we talk, how we organize ourselves, Hamachek has some really insightful passages in this article that I think are relevant, directly relevant to the whole organizational strategy of the Vino Veritas Society. And so I'm going to make a suggestion that we leave our listeners on a cliffhanger, and they're going to have to come back to the next podcast to hear us dig into the rest of this article.
I'm going to give them a little teaser way of cheating to know what we're going to talk about.
Okay.
You're going to get a copy of this. Read it. You're going to know some of the things we're going to talk about. Take a half hour. It's a really thoughtful read, and I hope some of you some of our listeners over the next few weeks, or over the next week rather, when you read this, if something strikes you as, I have a question about that, I don't like that, or I really like this, post it in the comments. Let us see those so we can know, we can actually respond to some of those things. But the latter half of this piece, he really gets into what does it take to be a successful dissident? And I think that's the topic for next week.
I think so too. Until then, we will remain guardians of the American idea.
Nos sumus custodes.